Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
Welcome to Understanding Islam. This last series we're calling Bearers of the Final Message. And today in program 6, we're going to be looking at the relationship of Islam with other faiths. Now, the reality is that the world into which Islam came, the Arabian Peninsula in the time of Prophet Muhammad, was a multi-faith world. There were people of other major faiths around, and there were lots of people who were worshipping local idols of their own making. And all throughout its history, Islam has lived alongside other faiths. In fact, it's always been a minority worldwide. Even today, there are more Muslims alive today than there have ever been in human history, and yet still only about 20% of human beings alive today are Muslims. Therefore, the relationship of Islam with other faiths is an important part of the picture. There are some things that we need to get very clear from the beginning. That is, the Quran teaches that God creates all humankind from a single seed. We are, therefore, if you like, members of the one human family. And in this extent, we are all equal in the sight of God. God has no favorites. God is not the God of a particular tribe or nation or people or religion, but rather God is the God of all humankind. So all human beings are in a relationship with God. From the very beginning, human beings have had these two great dignities of being the Abd, the loving servant of God, and the Khalifa, the regent of God upon earth. And in order to fulfill this function, right the way from the time of Adam and Eve onwards, God has sent guidance to human communities on how to live the human project. Now, the essence of that guidance has always been the same, and so we have a continuity in God's guidance to humankind. God has also sent prophets to guide the human communities of the earth to live out that message according to the divine revelation that was given to them. Now, mention of prophets is helpful here, because the Quran tells us we do not know the total number of prophets that God has sent to the earth. We have a hadith of the Prophet in which he speaks of 124,000. Now, the Quran actually mentions by name 25. Therefore, we can say that there are 123,975 vacancies on the list of prophets. We simply do not know the vast majority of the prophets who've been sent to the earth, and therefore it's an open question. And at times in human history, Muslim scholars have debated whether or not, let's say, the Buddha or Zoroaster could have been earlier prophets sent by God to their communities. We just don't know. But it does mean that God has been planting amongst all the communities of the earth. And this then needs to affect the way in which Muslims think about other communities in the world with whom they come into contact. So it's not that they live in a state of total ignorance, but rather the attitude should be, God has been there before. God has been planting amongst these people, sending them prophets and guidance. This means that we ought to be looking for the signs of God's earlier activity amongst these people. And those things that we find that are in agreement with the Quran, we can say these are signs of God's earlier revelation and guidance. And those things that are opposed to the fundamental principles that are taught in the Quran, we can say these things have been developed by this community not from God's guidance, but from human interpretation or human distortion. So the Quran acts as the criterion. It calls itself Al-Furqan, the criterion by which other things can be judged. That which agrees with it has a high probability of coming from God. That which disagrees with it does not come from the guidance of God. This means that every human being is in this same relationship with God. We have, as it were, a natural disposition within ourselves to live according to God's guidance. There is a verse in the Quran in which God has a conference of the pre-embodied souls, that is, human souls before they are sent to the earth. And God questions them, "Am I not your Lord?" And they chorus, "Yes, indeed you are." Therefore, a natural disposition within the human being to live under the rule, the guidance, the direction of God through his revelations and through the prophets. We call this the Deen al-Fitra, the natural way for the human being to live. Now, only God can judge the ultimate disposition of any human being. Muslims are not equipped to judge, but rather they have the duty to warn and to guide. Prophet Muhammad himself is told, "You are sent as but a warner amongst these people." Your job is done when you have delivered the message and told people this is God's guidance for the way that you should live. Now, in the early centuries then, before the time of the coming of the Quran and Prophet Muhammad, we can say that there were potentially many paths on earth that would lead people, according to God's guidance, to paradise. It's for God to judge. But a definitive moment comes in human history. With the year 610, the sending down of the first revelation of the Quran, the prophethood of Muhammad, we can say that human history turns into a new relationship. A new page of history is turned. From this time onwards, the Quran and the teaching of Prophet Muhammad represent the only straight path that leads to paradise, which is available on earth today. So therefore, if human beings knew what was best for them, they would follow the guidance of Quran and the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad. And this includes the people of earlier revelations. They should recognize the truth of Quran and the prophecy of Muhammad, and they should come on board and follow his teaching. But the reality is that there are millions and millions of people on earth today who have never heard about the Quran or about Prophet Muhammad. So they are not rejectors of that message. They live in ignorance of it. Now, obviously, God is just. There is a difference between somebody who knows and rejects and somebody who has never heard the message. And those who have never heard the message then are liable to live according to what they know of the earlier revelations that has been sent to them, and according to their natural disposition, their Deen al-Fitra, and it is then for God to judge. So we can allow for ignorance as opposed to rejection of the message. I find it helpful to think about the relationship of Islam to other faiths under 5 classifications, 5 categories. The first is only God is to be worshipped. There is no idol worship. The second is that God exists. So those religious traditions or philosophies that have no place for God, what about those? The third is that revelation is given by God to guide human beings. So what about those religious traditions that have lost their revelation or perhaps don't know that they ever had one? The fourth classification is the Quran and Muhammad are the last revelation and the last prophet. And therefore, if one says that one has a later revelation or a later prophet, what about those? And then the final group are those people that the Quran calls the Ahl Kitab, or the people of the book, the people of the earlier revelation. So let's take each of those five in turn. Remember the situation in the Arabian Peninsula at the time when Prophet Muhammad was born and growing up. It was a time of idol worship. There were hundreds of different idols that are being worshipped by the Arabs of that time. And then comes the Quran, and then comes the guidance of the Prophet. And the critical question is, do you worship the one and only God, or do you worship idols? That was the benchmark, whether you've become a Muslim or not. And therefore Islam has always had a problem with anything that looks like idol worship. Now, idol worship isn't just worshipping things that you have carved or painted or sculpted, or even things that you just imagine. Idol worship is worshipping anything in addition to or alongside God. Indeed, shirk, which is to associate partners with God, to worship God plus something else, we're told in the Quran, is the one sin that God will never forgive. Now, shirk is to worship anything in addition to God or alongside God, the ancient gods of my people, to worship a local holy person instead of or alongside of God. It rules out all forms of idol worship, semi-divine people, divine people, incarnations of divinity. It rules out as well all forms of polytheism and pyramids of gods, henotheism as we call them. Anything which is worshipping something in addition to or alongside God is then forbidden. Now, this means that those religious traditions that use images, statues, icons are always suspicious for Muslims. Are you worshipping that instead of worshipping God? You can imagine that in the case of the religions of India that we collectively call Hinduism, in which it's very common to have a murti, to have an image of some aspect of the divine, Muslims are always suspicious about this. Are you worshipping that image? Now, the reality is that you can speak to some Hindus and they will be very clear there is only one God who is invisible, is beyond our ability to know, and all these various images are just reminders to us of some of those aspects of God. And other Hindus will say, no, these are gods that we worship. We worship many different gods, and this one is the God of my people, of my ancestors. And so the relationship between Islam and Hinduism has always been a problematic one. But remember that during the Mughal period in India, they looked at the Hindu people who were following the Vedas, and they said, it seems quite possible that the Vedas are part of the earlier revelation that was sent to the people of India. and therefore they gave those Vedantic Hindus, as we would call them, a particular status, the people of the earlier revelation in India at that time. We can see that Judaism forbids all forms of images, but Christianity, for example, it goes in for images in some of its schools, where you can see statues, stained glass windows, crucifixes, figures of Jesus on the cross, icons, which are understood by the Eastern churches as being windows into the divinity, windows into the unseen God. Well, how are these treated? How are they respected? How are they venerated? What sort of practices are associated with these Christian images? And one can see that Muslims can be really quite concerned that there are here things that look as though perhaps they are being worshipped. And so there's a question mark there. The second classification of religions, God exists. God is a reality. And therefore, in any religious or philosophical system that has no place for God, like atheistic communism, for example, or secular humanism, or any other atheistic tradition, Muslims will find it very hard to see that this is God-given if there is a denial of the existence of God. There are also forms of religious traditions that are called non-theistic. No God talk. Talk of God is an escape from the ultimate reality. So some forms of Buddhism, for example, are non-theistic. And some Muslim scholars have said, well, how can we say that this is really a religion if there is no God there who is being worshipped? Therefore, should we better think of this as being a philosophy of life rather than a religious tradition? Our third classification of religions is to say that religion is revealed by God to humankind. It is not made up by human beings. Now, there are lots of religious traditions in the world in which there is no revelation that can be identified. These are the traditions passed down to us by our ancestors. These are the ways that our people have always worshipped. Well, the Quran is very clear in saying a defense of these are the traditions of our ancestors is insufficient. What we need is the revelation, the prophets on which this has been based. So the ancient traditional religions of Africa, or of Asia, or of Europe, of the Americas, for example, where's the revelation that underpins this? Now remember, God has been at work amongst all the peoples of the earth. So it may well be that certain elements of that revelation, certain elements of the guidings of the prophets who were sent, has been kept by those people, a natural religiosity within the people who are now practicing those religious traditions. But it may also be that some things have been invented and developed by human beings and have been added in. We find religious traditions that worship the forces of nature, the rivers, the trees, ancient stones, the changing of the seasons, the rising and setting of the sun, the stars, the planets. Well, where does all this come from, Islam would say? Anything that looks as though it's a human construction is problematic for Islam. So in the modern period, New Age movements that weave together many ancient traditions, Muslim scholars will always be cautious in saying, well, where's the revelation that underpins this practice? And no revelation is problematic from an Islamic perspective. The fourth classification is to say that the Quran is the last revelation sent by God, and Prophet Muhammad is the last and the seal of the prophets. So if one says that one has a revelation after the Quran, by definition one hasn't. It isn't a divine revelation sent down upon the earth, because the Quran is to be the last. So the Book of Mormon, for example, could not be recognized by Muslim scholars as being a later, a 19th century revelation sent by God to the earth. In the same way, Muhammad is the last of the prophets. He is the last of all the prophets, the universal prophet. And therefore, if someone claims to have a prophet after Muhammad, well, this is problematic from an Islamic point of view. Baha'u'llah, for example, the 19th century prophet of the Baha'i faith, declared himself to be a new prophet of a new order, the new order that Baha'i comes to initiate. Well, from an Islamic perspective, Muhammad is the last of all the prophets, and therefore no new prophets of a new order. In the same way, the Ahmadiyya community, the followers of the teachings of Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian, there's a lot of confusion as to what status he is claimed to have by his community. Was he a reviver of the faith? Was he a minor prophet coming with an interpretation of the Quran which was something new? And so anything that looks like a new prophet, unacceptable as far as Muslim scholars are concerned. That brings us to the last of our 5 categories, the people of the earlier revelations. In Arabic, the Ahl Kitab, the people of the book, the people who were sent to scripture before the coming of Quran and Prophet Muhammad. 4 groups are mentioned by name in the Quran. They are the Jews and the Christians, and then 2 other groups that are called in the Quran the Sabians and the Magians. Now, they are accorded special status within Islamic understanding. They are monotheists who are worshipping God. They are worshipping the one and only God, the same God that is worshipped by Muslims. Next week, we're going to be looking in more detail at the Jews and the Christians. So just this week, I want to touch on the 2 other groups, the Sabians and the Magians. Now, it is not clear who these groups are from the Quran itself, but Muslim scholars have understood that Sabians or Sabians is a reference to the Mandeans, the followers of John the Baptist, who are found in Iraq and in parts of Iran, a very small community today, who worship one God, who practice frequent ritual baptism, and who recognize John, the prophet Yahya, John the Baptist, as being one of their earlier prophets sent by God. And so, by precaution then, they are regarded as being the Sabians of the Quran. And the 4th group who are mentioned are the Magians. These have been understood to be the followers of Zoroaster, the Zoroastrians of Persia, of Iran. They, monotheists again, having a prophet in Zoroaster, his writings have been left amongst them of guidance. And so therefore, again by precaution, they are accepted as the 4th of these groups of the people of the earlier revelation. Don't forget that there's an article that goes with each of these programs that can be downloaded from my website, And if you've missed any earlier episodes, you can always catch up by going to the on-demand section of the Ahlulbayt website. Next week, we're going to continue this theme and look at Judaism and Christianity and look at the Islamic critique of those two earlier faiths, people of the book. I look forward to seeing you then.